The doors of the great hall groaned as they opened, and every head in the room turned. Alara Voss had imagined this moment for 3 years. She had rehearsed the words, practiced the steadiness in her voice, planned exactly how she would walk, where she would look, what she would do with her hands so no one would see them tremble. She had not planned for him to be standing right there. Not seated on the obsidian throne at the far end of the hall. Not surrounded by advisors with his back turned. Standing 12 feet from the entrance, mid-conversation with his war general, close enough that she could see the exact moment recognition hit his face. King Soren Kale went still. Not the controlled stillness of a man composing himself. The absolute predatory stillness of a wolf who has caught a scent he never expected to smell again. His conversation stopped. The general beside him looked confused. Then followed the king's gaze to the doorway, and his confusion deepened. Alara's rehearsed composure cracked down the center. The hall was exactly as she remembered. Vaulted stone ceilings lost in shadow. The enormous Kale banner hanging behind the throne, a black wolf on a field of silver. She knew every stone in this room. She had walked across them 1,000 times as queen. 3 years. 3 years since she had stood in this hall. 3 years since she had walked out of the palace in the dead of winter with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret buried so deep inside her body that even she had not fully understood it yet. 3 years, and he looked exactly the same. Tall, brutally handsome, his dark hair cropped close, his jaw set in that hard, unreadable line she had spent the first year of their marriage trying to decode and the second year trying to forget. His shoulders filled the black military coat like it had been stitched around him. His amber eyes, wolf's eyes, burned into her from across the room. She was not prepared for the way her chest seized at the sight of him. Her wolf, dormant for so long she had almost forgotten the creature existed, surged beneath her skin with a force that nearly buckled her knees. The bond. The wretched bond that 3 years and 400 miles had not managed to sever. It roared to life like a fire doused in oil, flooding her veins with heat and longing and fury in equal measure. Alara locked her spine straight and lifted her chin. She had not come back for him. She had come back to end this. Behind her, hidden beneath the heavy traveling cloak draped over her nursemaid Bessa's arms, a small voice whimpered. Alara's blood turned to ice. Not now. Please. Not now. Soren's gaze shifted, moved past Alara's shoulder to the bundle in Bessa's arms. Something flickered across his face, fast and unreadable. His nostrils flared. The room had gone deathly silent. 40 courtiers, 6 council members, a dozen guards, all of them watching. Alara could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on her like stone. Soren took one step forward. Ilara, he said. Just her name. Low, rough, stripped of every pretense. It hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to deliver the speech she had spent 3 years composing. The words that would sever the bond, dissolve the marriage, and free them both. But before she could speak, the bundle in Bessa's arms let out a sharp, unmistakable cry. A child's cry. The sound cut through the silence of the great hall like a blade. Every person in the room heard it. Every person in the room saw the king's face change. The hardness did not leave. Something far more dangerous replaced it. A slow, terrible comprehension that moved through his features like a storm front rolling across open land. His amber eyes locked onto the bundle, then onto Alara, then back to the bundle. Whose child? He asked. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made seasoned generals take a step back. Ilara's throat closed, her carefully rehearsed words disintegrated. Everything she had planned, everything she had prepared, collapsed around her in the space of a single heartbeat. The courtiers were frozen. She could feel their shock radiating outward like heat from a forge. Whispers would follow. Scandal would follow. Everything she had tried to prevent by leaving in the first place was unraveling in front of 40 witnesses. Bessa shifted the child instinctively, drawing the bundle closer to her chest, protective. The nursemaid's face was pale, her eyes wide, but she held her ground. She had promised Alara she would hold her ground. Soren took another step forward, then another. Each one deliberate, measured, the walk of a predator closing distance. His gaze never left the child, because the child in Bessa's arms had just opened her eyes, and they were amber. Wolf's eyes. His eyes. The king stopped breathing. Ilara had not wanted to marry a king. She had not wanted to marry anyone, truthfully, but a king least of all. The arrangement had been forged in the language of politics, not affection. Her father, Lord Marin Voss of the Thornwall province, had leveraged his only daughter's hand in exchange for military protection against the Ashfang raids that had been decimating the borderlands for 2 brutal seasons. Soren Kale, newly crowned and barely 26, needed the allegiance of the border lords to stabilize a kingdom still bleeding from his father's disastrous reign. It was a transaction. Clean, logical, mutually beneficial. Alara had arrived at the Ironmere Palace on a gray morning in late autumn, her belongings packed into 3 trunks, and her expectations packed into none. She had told herself she would be useful, she would fulfill her duties, produce an heir when required, and otherwise stay out of the way. She had not expected Soren Kale to be beautiful, not handsome in the polished, courtly way she had braced for. Beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Sharp-featured, intense, with amber eyes that tracked movement like something feral lived behind them. He barely spoke to her the first week. Not out of cruelty, she realized later, but because he genuinely did not know how. The young king had been raised by a father who communicated through orders and violence, and Soren had inherited the silence without the cruelty. He attended every meal with her, pulled her chair out himself, a gesture so mechanical it was clearly rehearsed, answered her questions in as few words as possible, then returned to whatever tactical report was consuming him. Alara filled the silence because someone had to. She told him about the Thornwall, about the wild horses that ran along the ridge in spring, about the ancient standing stones where her grandmother had taught her to identify herbs by taste and smell. She talked about the time she accidentally poisoned a goat with the wrong tincture and had to chase it through the market square for 20 minutes while it foamed at the mouth. He did not laugh, but on the 7th evening he asked, "Did the goat survive?" Alara had stared at him across the long table, stunned into silence for perhaps the first time in her life. He had been listening, to all of it. "The goat was fine," she managed. "My dignity did not recover." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile. More like the place where a smile would eventually learn to live. The marriage, against all odds, began to breathe, not flourish. Soren remained guarded, his emotional vocabulary limited to duty, strategy, and the occasional flicker of dry humor that surfaced without warning. But Alara learned to read the silences, the way he lingered at the breakfast table when she was talking, pretending to read reports, the way he positioned himself between her and any perceived threat without conscious thought, the way his hand would hover near the small of her back as they walked, never quite touching, as if he wanted to, but had not given himself permission. She learned other things too. The kingdom was fracturing. The Ashfang wolves, driven from their ancestral hunting grounds by famine, were growing bolder, and the noble houses were split between those who wanted diplomacy and those who wanted extermination. Soren worked constantly. She would find him in his study long past midnight, maps spread across the desk, candles burned to stumps. He ate when reminded. Slept, she suspected, almost never. One night, 2 months into the marriage, Alara woke to the sound of something breaking. She found him in his study, a shattered glass on the floor, his hands braced against the desk, his breathing ragged. "Soren?" she whispered from the doorway. He did not turn around. "Go back to bed." She did not. She crossed the room, knelt beside the broken glass, and began picking up the pieces. "Leave it," he said, his voice tight. You will cut yourself, she replied, not looking up. Ilara. I am picking up glass, not staging a revolt. You can resume brooding in a moment. The silence that followed was so sharp she thought she had gone too far. Then she heard a sound she had never heard before. A breath that was almost a laugh, bitten off before it could fully form. She looked up. His eyes were fixed on her, and in them she saw something that made her chest tighten. Not amusement, though that was there. Exhaustion. The kind that lived in the bones and had nothing to do with sleep. The council wants me to march on the Ashfang wintering grounds, he said quietly. Raise them before spring. Women and children included? Ilara asked. His jaw tightened. That is the implication. And what do you want? He stared at her like no one had ever asked him that question. Maybe no one had. I want them to stop dying, he said. All of them. Something changed between them that night. Not the bond. The bond had always been there. A low hum beneath her skin that she had learned to ignore. This was different. This was a choice. Two people deciding to see each other. The months that followed were the closest thing to happiness Ilara had ever known. It arrived quietly, without announcement, in the small moments she had not thought to guard herself against. The way he started waiting for her before eating, even when she was late. The way he began leaving books on her nightstand, volumes on herbalism and botanical illustration that he had clearly gone out of his way to find. The way he said her name differently now, softer, like it had become something worth being careful with. She fell in love with him the way you fall asleep. Slowly, then all at once. And by the time she realized what had happened, it was far too late to protect herself. They shared their first night together in late winter, when snow piled against the windows and the fire burned low. He was careful with her in a way that undid her completely. Afterward, he held her against his chest and pressed his mouth to her hair, and she felt the bond between them flare bright and warm and terrifying. She should have known then. Happiness that fierce always comes with a price. And then he rode to war. The war was supposed to last weeks. It lasted 14 months. Ilara received letters at first. Short, clipped dispatches written in Soren's cramped hand, stripped of anything personal. Casualty figures that climbed with each message. She read between the lines and tasted ash. Then the letters stopped. Weeks of silence. She petitioned Soren's steward, Lord Hadrian, for information and received polished reassurances that told her nothing. She pressed the War Council for updates and was told, with varying degrees of condescension, that the Queen's concern was noted and unnecessary. It was Hadrian who finally told her the truth. Not all of it. Just enough to devastate. There have been significant losses, he said, standing in the doorway of her chambers like he did not intend to stay long enough to sit. The Ashfang resistance was more organized than anticipated. The king was injured in the third engagement. The floor tilted beneath Ilara's feet. How badly? He will recover. That is not what I asked. Hadrian's expression remained immaculate. The king will recover, Your Majesty. That is all I am authorized to share. Ilara did not sleep that night, or the next. She lay in their bed, his side cold and untouched, and pressed her hand against the bond in her chest like she could feel him through it. Some nights she thought she could. A distant pulse of pain and fury and something bleak that she could not name. Other nights, there was nothing. Just silence where he used to be. The war ended in the 14th month. Soren returned on a morning so bright it felt like mockery. Ilara was in the courtyard when the riders came through the gate. He rode at the front, flanked by what remained of his personal guard. He dismounted slowly, and she could see it immediately, the way he favored his left side, the new scar that carved a pale line from his temple to his jaw, the hollowed look in his face. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were flat, emptied of everything she had spent months learning to read. She walked toward him. He watched her approach with no expression at all. You are home, she said, searching his face for the man she had married. Yes, he replied. The word carried nothing. That night he sat on the edge of their bed and stared at the wall. Alara sat beside him and waited. Minutes passed, long and heavy. She reached for his hand. He pulled away. Not violently, gently, even. But the withdrawal was absolute. He stood, crossed to the door, and said without turning, "I will sleep in the study tonight." He slept in the study every night after that. The man who returned from the Ashfang War wore Soren's face but lived behind glass. He attended councils, issued orders, ate when prompted, and performed every function required of a king with mechanical precision. But the warmth was gone. The dry humor was gone. The hovering hand at her back was gone. Alara tried. She talked to him the way she used to, filling silences with stories. He listened politely and responded with nothing. She brought him meals in his study. He thanked her with the detached courtesy of a man addressing a servant. She reached for the bond, pressed against it, tried to feel him through the connection that had once hummed between them. It was like pressing her hand against stone. 3 months after his return, the court began to whisper. The queen was barren. The king was cold. The marriage was a failure. The border lords were restless, questioning whether the alliance still held value without an heir. Alara could bear the whispers. She could bear the cold bed and the locked study door, and the polite, empty courtesy he offered in place of everything he used to be. What she could not bear was the night she finally confronted him. She found him in his study past midnight, the same scene from a year ago. But the man sitting behind the desk was a stranger. "Soren, talk to me," she said. "Please." He looked up. "About what?" "About anything. About the war. About what happened to you. About why you will not let me near you." Something moved behind his eyes, deep and fast, like a creature diving beneath the surface. Then it was gone. "Nothing happened to me," he said. "You are lying. I am telling you what you need to hear. I need to hear the truth." He stood, and the full height of him filled the room in a way that used to make her feel safe, and now made her feel like she was standing on the wrong side of a locked door. "The truth," he said, his voice flat, "is that the war is over, the kingdom is stable, you are safe. There is nothing more to discuss." "And us?" Alara whispered. "Is there anything left to discuss about us?" The silence lasted too long. She watched his face and saw the answer before he spoke it. "You should rest," he said. "It is late." She left his study that night and did not go back. She did not reach for the bond again. She did not try to fill the silence. 2 weeks later, a healer in the servants' quarters confirmed what Ilara had suspected for days. She was carrying the king's child. She stood in the healer's dim room, her hand pressed to her stomach, and felt the ground open beneath her. A child. His child. Growing inside her while the man who had fathered it could not bring himself to touch her hand. She could tell him. She could walk to his study right now and tell him, and maybe it would change everything. Maybe it would crack the glass. Maybe he would come back to her. Or maybe he would look at her the way he had been looking at her for 3 months. Politely, distantly, like she was a duty he had already fulfilled. Alara made her decision that night. She packed one trunk. She left her crown on the vanity, her rings on the nightstand, and a sealed letter on his desk that said only what needed to be said. She asked for nothing. She explained nothing. She simply left. She walked out of the Iron Mirror Palace before dawn, accompanied only by Bessa, her nursemaid, and disappeared into the winter dark. No one followed her, and for 3 years, she convinced herself that no one had wanted to. The great hall had erupted into chaos the moment Alara was escorted out. She knew this because she could hear it through the walls, the roar of voices, Soren's above them all, issuing commands that shook dust from the rafters. They put her in a waiting chamber off the east corridor. Stone walls, a narrow window, a single chair. Bessa sat beside her, the child asleep again in her arms, mercifully quiet. "That went well," Bessa said. Alara pressed her hands over her face. He saw her. He saw her eyes. Every person in that room saw her eyes, lamb. The door opened. A woman entered, tall and angular, with silver threaded through dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. She wore healer's robes and carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had spent decades being right about things other people did not want to hear. "I am Thessaly," the woman said, "chief healer of the Ironmere court. You will forgive the lack of pleasantries. The king has demanded a full examination of the child within the hour." Alara's arms tightened instinctively. "No one is examining my daughter without my presence." Thessaly studied her for a long moment. "I would not expect otherwise. Come." The examination took place in the healer's wing. Thessaly was thorough, gentle, and utterly silent throughout. She checked the child's heartbeat, reflexes, breathing, and grip. She held the child up to the light and looked into her eyes for a long time. "Her name?" Thessaly asked. "Neve," Alara said. "How old?" 2 years and 4 months. Thessaly set the child down carefully and turned to face Alara. "The child is healthy?" Thessaly said. "Strong. Her wolf signature is remarkably developed for her age." "What does that mean?" Alara asked, though she already knew. "It means she is his," Thessaly said. "There will be no question. Her blood carries the Kyle line so strongly that any healer in the realm could confirm it." She paused. "The king will want to see you." "The king can wait." Thessaly's eyebrows rose. Behind her, Bessa made a small choking sound. "I did not come here to be summoned," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I came here to file a formal dissolution of the mate bond and the marriage. I have the documents prepared. I need his signature and the witness of a court healer. That is all." The quiet that settled over the room was immense. "You want to dissolve the bond?" Thessaly repeated slowly. "Yes. With a 2-year-old child who carries the royal bloodline. The child is mine. I am not asking for anything from him. No title, no inheritance, no claim to the throne. I want a clean severance." Thessaly looked at her the way one looks at a person standing on the edge of a cliff and calling it a scenic view. "My dear," she said, "the king tore apart his study when you left. He sent search parties to every province. He had the border watched for 8 months. When the searches failed, he ordered the court to never speak your name in his presence again. Not because he wanted to forget, but because hearing it was unbearable." Alara's heart stuttered. "He has not taken another mate," Thessaly continued. "He has not so much as looked at another woman. The court has presented candidates. Noble daughters, political alliances, everything a king might need. He has rejected every single one." The room felt too small suddenly. The air felt too thin. "That changes nothing," Alara managed, though her voice cracked on the last word. Thessaly gave her a look that said she did not believe that for a moment. "The king will see you now," she said. "And I strongly suggest you do not lead with the dissolution papers." They stopped at a door she knew. His private study. The guard opened it without knocking. Soren stood with his back to the room, his hands braced against the windowsill, staring out at the courtyard below. He did not turn when she entered. The door closed behind her, and they were alone. The silence was suffocating. "You left," he said. His voice was raw, stripped down to something she had never heard before. Not the king's voice, not the commander's voice, something underneath all of it. "You were gone," Alara replied. "Long before I was." He turned, and the look on his face nearly destroyed her. It was not anger, though she could see anger beneath the surface, coiled and barely contained. It was devastation. The kind that lives in a person for years and hollows them out from the inside. "You were pregnant," he said. "You were pregnant, and you did not tell me. You would not have heard me if I had." He flinched. "You think so little of me?" "I think you were drowning, and I was not going to let my child drown with you." The word "my" landed between them like a blade. His eyes went dark. "Our child?" he corrected, his voice dangerously quiet. She is our child, Alara. Alara's throat tightened. She had prepared for his anger. She had braced for his authority, his commands, his cold, kingly composure. She had not prepared for the grief. I want to see her, he said. Soren. I have a daughter I have never held. I have a daughter whose name I did not know until a healer told me 20 minutes ago. His voice broke on the last word, and the sound of it cracked something open in Alara's chest that she had spent 3 years sealing shut. I will not keep her from you, Alara said quietly. That was never my intention. Then why? He took a step toward her. Why did you run? Because I loved you, she said, and the truth of it burned coming out. And you could not feel it. You could not feel anything. And I would rather have raised her alone than raise her in a house where her father looked through her the way you looked through me. Soren stared at her. His hands hung at his sides, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. You should have told me, he whispered. You should have let me in, she whispered back. Neither of them moved. The distance between them was 6 feet and 3 years, and every word they had not said, and Alara did not know how to cross it. Then, from down the corridor, carried through stone and silence, came the sound of a child crying. Soren's entire body went rigid. Something primal moved through him, instinct overriding everything else. He moved toward the door before Alara could speak, driven by something deeper than thought. Soren, wait, Alara called after him. But the king was already gone. Alara caught up with him in the corridor outside the healer's wing. She grabbed his arm, felt the heat of him through the fabric, and the bond flared so violently between them that she nearly lost her footing. You cannot just storm in there, she said, breathless. She does not know you. She is 2 years old, and she is in a strange place surrounded by strangers. If you walk in there looking like that, you will terrify her. Soren stopped. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Looking like what? Like a king preparing for battle. Something shifted in his expression. The hard lines softened, just fractionally, and she saw it again, the man beneath the armor. The one who had asked about a goat. The one whose hand had hovered at her back, wanting to touch but not knowing how. What do I do? He asked, and the vulnerability in the question was so raw, so unlike anything she had ever heard from him, that Alara's chest ached. You sit down, she said. You make yourself small. You let her come to you. He looked at her like she had asked him to disarm in enemy territory. I know, Alara said. But she is not a council meeting. She is a child, and she decides who she trusts. They entered the healer's wing together. Neve was sitting on Bessa's lap, her small face blotchy from crying, her amber eyes wide and suspicious. When she saw Ilara, she reached out immediately, her fingers grasping. Mama, she said. Ilara took her, pressing the child against her chest, and felt the knot in her stomach loosen for the first time since she had stepped through the palace gates. Neve's small fingers twisted into her hair, holding on. Soren had stopped in the doorway. He was staring at the child with an expression Alara had never seen on his face. Not the controlled blankness he wore for the court. Not the intensity he carried into war councils. Something entirely unguarded, stripped of every defense, and so full of longing it was almost unbearable to witness. Neve, Alara said softly, shifting the child in her arms. This is someone Mama wants you to meet. Neve turned her head and looked at the king of the realm. Soren did what Alara had told him. He sat down. Not in a chair. On the floor. The Alpha King of Ironmere, commander of armies, conqueror of the Ashfang territories, sat down on the cold stone floor of the healer's wing and made himself small. Neve watched him with the solemn, unblinking assessment that only small children are capable of. Soren did not move, did not speak, did not reach for her. A minute passed, then 2. Neve's grip on Alara's hair loosened. She leaned forward slightly, studying the stranger on the floor with open curiosity. Then she pointed at the scar on his face. "Hurt?" she said. Something cracked in Soren's composure. "Yes," he managed, "but it is better now." Neve considered this. Then she wriggled free of Alara's arms, slid to the floor, and toddled across the distance between them with the fearless confidence of someone who has not yet learned that the world can be cruel. She stopped in front of him, reached up with one small hand, and pressed her palm against the scar on his cheek. Soren's eyes closed. His hand came up, trembling, and covered hers. His shoulders shook once, hard, and he pressed his lips together to keep the sound inside. Behind them, Bessa turned away, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Thessaly, who had been standing in the doorway observing with clinical detachment, looked down at her hands. Neve patted the scar gently. "Better?" she asked. "Yes," Soren said, his voice barely holding. "Much better." Neve smiled. It was a devastating thing, that smile. Because it was Alara's smile on a face that was unmistakably his, and the combination of the two of them in one small person seemed to undo something fundamental in the king's composure. He gathered the child into his arms slowly, carefully, like she was made of something that would shatter if he moved too fast. Neve settled against his chest without protest, her head tucking beneath his chin. Soren held her, and Alara watched the last 3 years catch up with him all at once. Alara watched from across the room, tears streaming silently down her face, and felt something she had not expected. Not the dissolution she had come for. Not the clean severance she had planned. Something far more dangerous. Hope. That night, Thessaly assigned Alara a chamber in the royal wing. Not her old rooms. Those had been sealed since the day she left. A new chamber, 2 doors down from Soren's. "The king has requested that you remain in the palace while the matter of the child's status is resolved," Thessaly informed her. Alara understood perfectly. Neve was no longer just her daughter. She was a political reality, a bloodline, a succession, a claim to the throne that every noble house would have an opinion about. She had walked back into the palace to end her marriage. Instead, she had handed Soren the one thing that made leaving again nearly impossible. Bessa appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the scent of regret. "The king has requested to see Neve again tomorrow morning," she said. He was very polite about it. Used the word please twice. Alara sat on the edge of the bed. "He sat on the floor, Bessa. He sat on the floor for her. Men will do extraordinary things when they discover what they have lost." Alara pressed her hands over her eyes. The bond hummed in her chest, louder than it had been in years, warming her from the inside like sunlight through glass. She hated it. She needed it. Both feelings were true, and neither one was winning. Down the corridor, through stone and silence, she heard Soren's door close. He was 2 rooms away. Close enough to feel through the bond if she let herself. Close enough that her wolf pressed against her ribs, restless and aching, desperate to close the distance. Alara rolled over, pulled the blanket to her chin, and told herself she would file the dissolution papers in the morning. She did not file them in the morning. Days passed, and Alara did not file the papers. She told herself it was logistics. The court registrar was unavailable. The timing was not right. She knew she was lying. The truth was simpler. Soren was dismantling every wall she had built, and he was doing it without trying. He was doing it by sitting on the floor. Every morning, he appeared at the nursery Thessaly had arranged. He knocked. He waited for permission to enter. He sat on the floor, and he let Neve decide the terms. The first morning, Neve brought him a wooden horse from a basket of toys. She set it on his knee and said, "Horse." He looked at the toy like it was the most complex diplomatic document he had ever received. "Yes," he confirmed. "Horse." The second morning, she climbed into his lap without warning. Soren froze, his hands hovering in the air like he was afraid any movement would break the spell. His eyes found Alara's across the room, and the helplessness in them was so raw that she had to look away before she did something unforgivable, like cross the room and touch him. By the 4th morning, Neve had claimed him entirely. She fed him imaginary food from a wooden cup, and he pretended to eat it. She put a cloth over his head and shrieked with delight when he pulled it off. He laughed. The sound stopped Alara dead in the doorway. She had heard him laugh before, once or twice in the early months of their marriage, bitten off sounds that barely qualified. This was different. This was full and startled and genuine, pulled out of him by a 2-year-old with a cloth on his head, and it transformed his entire face. He caught her staring, their eyes held across the nursery, and the air between them thickened. Alara looked away first. She could not afford this. Every moment she stayed, every morning she watched him learn to be a father, she was losing ground. She had come here with a purpose, dissolution, freedom, a clean break from a man who had not been able to love her when it mattered. But the man in the nursery was not the man she had left. That man had been unreachable, a ghost wearing the shape of someone she loved. This man sat on cold stone floors. This man said please twice. This man held a wooden horse on his knee with the careful reverence of someone who understood what he had nearly lost. Alara was terrified. Not of him, of herself, of what she would do if she stayed too long, because once the walls came down, she would not survive building them again. On the 5th night, Neve had a fever. It came on fast, a flushed face at supper, glassy eyes by bedtime, and a temperature that climbed until her small body radiated heat. Alara sat beside her cot, pressing cool cloths to her forehead. A knock at the door. Not a servant's knock. Too heavy, too deliberate. She opened it. Soren stood in the corridor, still dressed, his coat unbuttoned. It was past midnight. "Thessaly told me," he said. "How is she?" "It is a fever. Children get fevers. She will be fine." He did not move, did not leave. His gaze shifted past Alara's shoulder to the cot where Neve lay, flushed and whimpering, and something in his face tightened. "May I come in?" he asked. She should have said no. Every rational part of her brain screamed no. Instead, she stepped aside. He moved to the cot and knelt beside it. His hand, the hand that had held swords and signed execution orders and commanded the largest army in the realm, reached out and brushed the damp hair from Neve's forehead with a tenderness that made Alara's knees weak. "She is burning up," he murmured. "I know. I have been applying compresses. The fever should break by morning." He looked up at her. "You should rest. I will stay with her." "Soren, you have been watching her alone for 2 years. Let me watch her tonight." The words hit her harder than he could have known. Every midnight fever, every bout of teething pain, every nightmare she had soothed alone. All of it concentrated into a single sentence that acknowledged what she had carried without him. "Fine," she whispered, because she was too tired to fight the thing she wanted. She settled into the chair by the window and watched him sit vigil beside their daughter. His hand rested on the edge of the cot, his fingers close enough for Neve to grasp if she reached in her sleep. His gaze never left the child's face. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The fever climbed, peaked, then slowly began to break. Neve's breathing steadied. Her small hand found Soren's finger and wrapped around it. He made a sound. Low, quiet, and so full of grief it made Alara's chest cave. 2 years, he said, not looking at her. "I missed 2 years." Alara closed her eyes. "I know." Her first word, her first steps. Every fever, every nightmare, every morning she woke up and I was not there. "You were not there before I left either," Alara said, and the words came out gentler than she intended. He bowed his head over his daughter's cot. "I know," he said. "I know that. And I will carry it for the rest of my life." He paused, his voice dropping to something barely audible. "I will not ask you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I am not the man you left." Alara stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, at the way his free hand gripped the edge of the cot like it was the only thing holding him upright. "Then who are you?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were wet. Someone who would very much like the chance to find out, he said. Ilara did not respond. She could not. The words lodged in her throat, trapped between everything she wanted to say and everything she was afraid to feel. The fire crackled. Neve slept. Soren turned back to the cot and kept his vigil. And somewhere in the small hours of the morning, without meaning to, Ilara fell asleep in the chair by the window. She woke to morning light and found a blanket draped over her that had not been there when she fell asleep. Soren was gone. Neve was still sleeping, her fever broken, her color healthy, her small fist curled around nothing where his finger used to be. On the nightstand beside the cot, placed carefully so it would be the first thing Ilara saw, was a single folded piece of paper. She opened it with trembling hands. 2 words, written in his cramped, familiar hand. I looked. She had convinced herself for 3 years that no one had come looking for her when she left. He had. The note fell from her fingers, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to muffle the sound that escaped. Ilara found Thessaly in the healer's wing that afternoon, grinding something that smelled of copper and burnt rosemary. I need to understand something, Ilara said without preamble. The bond? It should have weakened when I left. 3 years, 400 miles. Everything I have read says distance degrades an incomplete bond over time, but it has not weakened. If anything, it is stronger now than when I left. Thessaly did not look up from her mortar. That is because the bond was never incomplete. Ilara stared at her. What? Thessaly set the pestle down and turned to face her. You shared a marriage bed. You conceived a child together. The bond sealed the moment Neve was conceived, whether you exchanged mating marks or not. A child is the deepest form of bonding 2 wolves can create. It is permanent. It cannot be dissolved. The floor dropped from beneath Ilara's feet. Dissolution has been done before, she said, though her voice had gone thin. For incomplete bonds, yes. For political marriages where the bond never fully formed. But yours formed, Ilara. It formed and it rooted and it grew. And then you ran from it, and it stretched across every mile between you and held. Thessaly paused. The bond kept you alive, both of you. Ilara sank into the nearest chair. Her hands were shaking. You are telling me there is no dissolution. I am telling you the paperwork is meaningless. You could sign every document in the kingdom and stand before every healer and magistrate in the realm, and the bond would still be there. You would still feel him. He would still feel you, and it would slowly kill you both. Then what was the point? Ilara's voice cracked. What was the point of leaving? Of all of it? Thessaly regarded her quietly. Perhaps the point was not to break the bond. Perhaps the point was to understand what it meant. Ilara pressed her hands against her face. 3 years of running. 3 years of convincing herself she could cut herself free. And all of it had been built on sand. The bond was permanent. The distance had not freed them. It had been slowly destroying them both. Does he know? Ilara asked. I told him this morning, Thessaly said. He took it about as well as you are taking it now. What did he say? Thessaly's mouth twitched. He said, and I am quoting directly, that he did not need a healer to tell him what his wolf had been screaming at him for 3 years. Ilara let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. She found him in the courtyard as the sun was setting, sitting on the low stone wall near the fountain. He was watching the sky, his coat unbuttoned, the scar on his face caught in the amber light. He looked tired. Not the hollow, dangerous exhaustion she remembered from after the war. A gentler tiredness, the kind that comes from feeling too much after years of feeling nothing. She sat beside him, not close enough to touch, close enough to feel the warmth of him. Thessaly told me, she said. I assumed she would. Silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Not the locked, impenetrable silence of 3 years ago. Something more tentative, like the careful quiet of 2 people who have both been wounded and are trying not to wound each other again. I owe you an explanation, Soren said. About the war. About why I could not reach you when I came back. Alara turned to look at him. You do not owe me anything. Yes, I do. He kept his gaze on the horizon, his jaw tight. I have never told anyone what happened in the Ashfang territories. Not Hadrian, not the council, not the healers. I buried it, and I told myself that was strength, and I let it rot inside me until it poisoned everything I touched. He paused. Including you. Soren. Let me say this. His voice was rough. If I stop, I will not start again. She fell silent. We marched on the Ashfang settlements because every other option had been exhausted. Fenric refused peace. His raids were escalating. Civilians were dying on our borders every week. He swallowed. But the settlements were not military encampments. They were villages, families. His hands clenched on his knees. I gave the order to hold back non-combatants, to separate the fighters from the civilians. He stopped, and the weight of what he was about to say pressed the air flat. It did not work, Alara said softly. No. The word was barely audible. The fighting spread too fast. Fenric had armed everyone, women, elders, adolescents, barely old enough to shift. They fought because they believed we were there to exterminate them. And in the chaos, my soldiers could not tell who was a combatant and who was a mother holding a kitchen knife because she was terrified. His voice fractured. I held a woman's body afterward. She could not have been more than 17. She had a child strapped to her back. The child survived. The mother did not. Alara's tears fell silently. She did not wipe them. When I came home, I was not here. Soren continued. My body was in this palace, but I was still in that settlement. I could not feel anything. You were right there. And I knew it. And I could not close the distance. It was like being trapped behind glass. I know, Alara whispered. I could feel it. He turned to her finally. His eyes were red, his face stripped of every defense. I thought if I stayed away from you, the rot would not spread. I thought if I locked it inside, it would stay contained. Instead, it drove you away, and I lost you. And I lost a daughter I did not know existed, and the only thing worse than the war was the silence you left behind. Ilara reached for his hand. He flinched at first, an instinct born of 3 years of untouching, but then his fingers opened and closed around hers, and the bond flared between them like a held breath finally released. I am sorry, he said. I am sorry too. They sat on the stone wall as the last light drained from the sky, their hands intertwined, neither one speaking, and Alara felt something shift in the architecture of her grief. Not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness would take time and honesty and 1,000 more conversations like this one, but something before forgiveness, something necessary. Understanding. From the window above, Bessa watched them and smiled. Beside her, Neve was asleep against her shoulder, one hand still clutching the wooden horse Soren had given her that morning. Things changed after the courtyard. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures or declarations that the court could witness and scrutinize. The changes were small, careful, and almost unbearably tender in their restraint. Soren began walking Alara back to her chamber after supper. Not touching, not speaking much, just the quiet presence of him beside her. At her door, he would pause. They would look at each other in the lamplight, and the space between them would hum with everything unsaid, and then he would say goodnight and walk to his own door 2 rooms away. It was maddening. It was beautiful. The nursery became their neutral ground. Neve, oblivious to the complicated history unfolding around her, served as the bridge neither of them could build alone. When Neve put a wooden crown on Soren's head and declared him King Papa, Ilara laughed so hard she had to leave the room. When she came back, Soren was still wearing the crown, his expression gravely dignified, while Neve arranged toy soldiers around his knees. I have been given a field promotion, he informed Ilara. You look very distinguished, Your Majesty. Neve seems to think I am also a horse. She tried to ride my back earlier. Did you let her? Of course I let her. She is my commanding officer. Alara bit her lip against the swell of warmth in her chest. This was the man she had married. The one who existed beneath the armor and the silence and the crushing weight of a crown he had never asked for. He had always been there, buried under rubble, and it had taken a 2-year-old with amber eyes to dig him out. But the tenderness between them coexisted with something darker. The bond was not patient. It pressed against Alara's ribs with increasing urgency, sharpening whenever Soren was near and hollowing when he was away. She caught herself leaning toward him when they sat together, caught herself breathing deeper when he passed close enough for his scent to reach her, caught herself staring at his hands, his jaw, the column of his throat. He was doing the same. She could feel it through the bond, a barely leashed heat that spiked when their eyes met and retreated the moment he became aware of it. On the 9th night after the courtyard, Alara could not sleep. The bond was relentless, pulling at her chest, humming in her blood, demanding closure in a language that had nothing to do with words. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and felt him through the wall, 2 rooms away, equally awake, equally restless. She got up, crossed her chamber in the dark, opened her door. He was standing in the corridor. They stared at each other. He was in sleep clothes, his shirt untucked, his feet bare against the cold stone. His hair was disordered, his eyes bright in the lamplight, and the look on his face was that of a man who had been fighting a losing battle and had finally stopped fighting. "I was coming to you," he said. "I know," she replied. "I was coming to you." The distance between them was 3 steps. He closed it in 2. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, his touch so careful it broke her heart. He pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt his breath shaking. "Tell me to go back to my room," he said. "No." "Alara." "No." She kissed him. Not gently, not carefully, not with the measured restraint they had been practicing for days. She kissed him with 3 years of silence behind it. He responded like a man who had been holding his breath for 1,000 days. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, and the bond surged between them, flooding every nerve with light and warmth and recognition. He held her face in his hands and kissed her until the distance between them no longer existed. That night, they chose each other again. Not with the careful uncertainty of 2 strangers, but with the tender, deliberate devotion of 2 people who knew exactly where the other was wounded. The bond sealed shut between them, complete and unbreakable, and the relief of it was so overwhelming that she wept. Soren held her afterward, his face buried in her hair. His heartbeat was steady against her back. "Stay," he said. Not a command, a plea. "I am not leaving," Alara whispered. "Not again. Not ever." He pulled her closer and she felt his breathing steady, felt the tension that had lived in his body for years begin, finally, to release. His arm tightened around her waist, his hand spread protectively across her stomach, and she felt him surrender to something he had been resisting since the moment she walked back through the doors of the great hall. Trust. She closed her eyes. The bond hummed between them, warm and golden and complete. She slept deeply for the first time in 3 years. But in the darkest part of the night, she woke to the sound of Soren screaming. Alara jolted upright. Soren was rigid beside her, his back arched, his hands clawing at the sheets. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something that was not in the room. "Soren." She grabbed his shoulders. "Soren, wake up." He did not respond. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and through the bond she felt it. A wave of horror so intense it nearly pulled her under. Guilt, grief, and something else. Something cold and patient and hungry that did not belong to him. The bond flared, and the room dissolved. Alara was standing in ash, gray ash that covered the ground as far as she could see, smelling of smoke and ruin. The sky was the color of bruised skin, and the air was perfectly still. She knew immediately this was not a dream. She could feel the ash between her toes. She could taste the soot on her tongue. Soren stood ahead of her, his back to her, motionless. Around him, arranged in a loose circle, stood figures, dozens of them. Men, women, adolescents, their faces blank, their wounds visible. The dead from the Ashfang territories. Ilara's stomach turned to ice. "Soren," she called, moving toward him. He did not react. His gaze was locked on the circle of the dead, his face drained of color, his body held in the rigid posture of a man enduring punishment he believed he deserved. The figures began to speak, not all at once. One voice, then another, layering over each other until the sound was a low, relentless chorus of accusation. "You gave the order. You could have stopped it. My child was on my back. You saw me. You did nothing." Ilara reached Soren's side and took his arm. He was shaking beneath her grip. Through the bond, she felt what he felt, and it was annihilating. The guilt was not a feeling. It was a structure, a prison built from the inside out, reinforced every night with the same accusations, the same faces. "This is not real," Ilara said firmly. "It is real," Soren said, his voice hollow. "They are real. They were real. They were real. What happened to them was real. But this place is not where they live now. This place is where you keep punishing yourself." The figures pressed closer. The young woman from his story stepped forward, the one with the child on her back, and Ilara saw her face clearly for the first time. Young, terrified, fierce. The face of a mother who had died trying to protect her child. "You killed me," the figure said, and Soren's knees buckled. Ilara caught him, held him upright with strength she did not know she possessed. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the dead. "You did not kill her. War killed her. A war you tried to prevent, fought to end, and carry with you every single day. You are not enough to save everyone. No one could have been. I should have been. Then I should have stayed. When you came back broken, I should have stayed and fought harder instead of running. I should have been strong enough to reach you through the glass. But I was not. And I have spent 3 years punishing myself for it, the way you have spent 3 years punishing yourself for this." He looked at her, really looked at her, not through the haze of guilt, but at her, seeing her. "We are the same," Ilara said, her voice breaking. "We both built prisons out of our own pain and climbed inside and called it what we deserved. But it is not what we deserve. It is not what Neve deserves. And it is not what they deserve." She gestured at the figures. "They deserve to be mourned. They deserve to be remembered. But they do not deserve to be turned into weapons you use against yourself every night." The ash stirred beneath their feet. The figures wavered. "You have a daughter who puts wooden crowns on your head," Ilara continued, tears running down her face. "You have a mate who crossed a kingdom to come back to you. You are allowed to carry the grief without letting it carry you. You are allowed to live, Soren. Please, choose to live." The circle of the dead stood still. Soren stared at them, his body shaking, the bond between them burning like a wire pulled taut. Then the young woman with the child on her back looked at Ilara. Not at Soren. At Ilara. And something in her blank expression shifted. The accusation drained away, and what remained was exhaustion. The exhaustion of being summoned night after night to perform a role in someone else's suffering. "Let us go," the woman said, and it was the first time the voice sounded like her own instead of his. Soren made a sound that came from somewhere deeper than his chest, a raw, tearing grief that had been locked inside him for years. He pressed his face into Ilara's shoulder and broke open, and the dam that had held everything back since the war collapsed completely. The figures dissolved. Not dramatically, not all at once. They faded the way morning fog fades, gradually, gently, as if they had been waiting for permission. The ash settled, The bruised sky lightened, and the landscape, the prison he had built inside himself, began to crumble. Alara held him as it fell apart around them, and she did not let go. They woke together, gasping, tangled in the sheets of his bed. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was cold. Dawn light crept through the curtains. Soren's face was wet. So was hers. He looked at her with something she had never seen in him before. Not the guarded stillness, not the controlled authority. Something new. Something raw and fragile and open. "Thank you," he whispered. Alara pressed her forehead to his. "Do not thank me. Just stay." "I am not going anywhere," he said. And for the first time, she believed him. The nightmares did not stop entirely. Grief does not work that way. You do not walk through a door and leave it behind forever. You carry it with you, but you learn slowly to carry it differently, to let it sit beside joy instead of smothering it. Soren still woke in the dark sometimes, his breathing sharp, his hands reaching. But Alara was there. She was always there. And her presence, the scent of her, the weight of the bond between them, pulled him back before the ash could settle around him again. They rebuilt slowly, with the careful patience of two people who understood how much damage haste could cause. The court adjusted, grudgingly at first, then with increasing acceptance as the change in the king became impossible to ignore. He smiled in public now. He left council meetings at a reasonable hour. He ate meals with his family. Neve, for her part, took to palace life with the fearless entitlement of a child who has decided that every room belongs to her personally. She appointed herself supervisor of the royal guard, inspector of the kitchens, and chief advisor on all matters involving toy horses. "She is too," Soren told Thessaly when the healer noted this was a terrible precedent. "She can have precedent when she is 3. On a morning in late spring, Alara woke to pale gold light pooling across the bed. Soren was still asleep beside her, one arm wrapped around her waist, his breathing deep and even and peaceful. Between them, nestled in the warm valley of blankets, Neve slept with her thumb in her mouth and her wooden horse tucked under her chin. Alara lay still and let the warmth of them fill her. The bond hummed softly, steady and golden, a quiet constant that no longer frightened her. She pressed her palm to Soren's chest and felt his heartbeat beneath her hand, slow and strong. She had come back to end her marriage. Instead, she had found the beginning of it. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.